a quiet maid, a sleeping mansion, a bruise she thought no one would ever see. At 3 a.m., in a kitchen that smelled of rain and cold marble, Elena Voss shattered, and the most dangerous man in New York stepped out of the dark and watched her fall apart. She thought she was alone. She was wrong. And what happened behind that locked door would change everything, for both of them. Stay with me until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since midnight, and by 3 in the morning, it had turned mean. The kind of rain that didn't just wet you but got into your bones, into the cracks of whatever you were holding together. It hammered the tall windows of the Moretti estate with a sound like fingers tapping impatiently on glass, relentless, as if the weather itself had a grudge against the night. Elena Voss moved through the east corridor without turning on a single light. She knew the house by feel now. 7 months of walking these same floors had mapped every creak, every soft patch in the carpet runner near the second landing, every draft that slipped under the door of the gallery room where oil paintings of men she didn't recognize watched from the walls. She didn't need light. Light was the enemy of invisible people, and Elena had spent the better part of her adult life perfecting the art of not being seen. Her feet were bare. She hadn't bothered with slippers. The cold of the marble floor came up through her soles and traveled into her ankles, her shins, her knees, and she welcomed it. Cold was something to focus on. Cold was simple. Cold didn't ask questions. The bruise on her left cheek was 4 hours old and already the color of a storm cloud, purple-black and tight with swelling that pushed against her eye socket and made the left side of her face feel like something foreign attached to her skull. She had looked at it in the small mirror above the sink in her basement room and then turned the mirror face down against the wall and hadn't looked again. The kitchen was at the back of the first floor, past the formal dining room with its long table that sat 18 and was almost never used, past the butler's pantry, past the secondary hallway that smelled permanently of furniture polish and something older, cedar, maybe, or the particular scent of money that had been in the same family long enough to become architectural. She pushed open the kitchen door. The room was enormous by any reasonable standard, commercial grade and everything, stainless steel surfaces that caught the faint blue light coming through the window above the sink, the pale glow of rain-wet sky filtering in from outside. The hanging copper pots above the central island were still. The house was asleep. 4,200 square feet of silence and wealth pressed down around her, and Elena was alone in the middle of it, standing on cold tile, wearing a thin cotton nightgown, with a hand pressed flat against her bruised cheek, as though she could hold herself together through pressure alone. She had come down for ice. That was the plan. Get ice from the freezer drawer, wrap it in a dish towel, hold it against her face long enough to take down the swelling before the morning staff arrived at 6 and saw what they would see and started asking what she didn't want to answer. A simple plan. The kind of plan you make when your whole life has become an exercise in managing damage quietly and moving on. She got as far as pulling open the freezer drawer. The cold air came up against her face, and something in it, the shock of it, the cleanness of it against the heat of her bruise, broke something inside her chest that had been holding on by pure mechanical will for 4 hours. Her shoulders went first, dropping as though the strings had been cut. Then her breath. She drew in a breath that was supposed to be controlled, and it came out as something else entirely. A sound she hadn't made since she was a child, ragged and cracked at the edges, and before she had the presence of mind to stop it, Elena Voss was crying over the open freezer drawer of Dante Moretti's kitchen at 3 in the morning, one hand gripping the steel handle and the other pressed over her mouth like she was trying to hold back something that had already gotten out. She cried without elegance. Tears and snot and the taste of copper from where she'd bitten the inside of her cheek earlier. She cried with her whole body, the kind of crying that comes from too long without it, months and years of held-in fear spilling out at the worst possible moment in the worst possible place. Her knees shook. She pressed her forehead against the cold edge of the freezer drawer and let herself have 30 seconds of it. Just 30 seconds. Just this once. Just because no one was watching. The kitchen door clicked shut behind her. The sound was soft, deliberate. Not the wind, not the settling of the house. A latch engaging. And then, the lock. That small, unmistakable sound of a deadbolt sliding home. Elena went still. She straightened slowly, the way you move when your body is trying to calculate threat before your mind has caught up. She closed the freezer drawer. She turned around. He was standing near the door, one hand still resting at the deadbolt, dressed in dark trousers and a collarless shirt that was open at the throat, the sleeves pushed up past the elbows. No jacket, no tie. The version of Dante Moretti that the outside world never saw. He was barefoot on the tile the same as she was, which should have made him seem more human and somehow didn't. He was watching her with eyes that had no particular expression in them, dark and still and patient in the way that deep water is patient, and the fact that he wasn't angry was almost worse than if he had been. She was aware of the bruise on her face with a sudden, scalding clarity. He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. His jaw moved slightly, a small tightening along the muscle beneath his ear, and then his gaze came back up to her eyes and stayed there. "Who hurt you?" His voice was low, quiet in the way that things are quiet before they become something else. Not a demand, not yet, but the framing of one. A sentence that expected an answer the way a locked room expects your full attention. Elena's hands found each other behind her back. Old habit. Make yourself smaller. Take up less space. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to wake anyone. I'll go back." "That's not what I asked." She stopped. The rain hit the windows. One of the copper pots swayed almost imperceptibly above the island, catching a draft from somewhere, ticking gently against its neighbor. "I fell," Elena said. "On the east steps, the outdoor ones. The rain. They get slippery." He looked at the bruise again. She watched him look at it and felt her face get hot beneath the swelling, humiliation layering itself on top of pain in that particular way she had always hated. Hated worse than the pain itself, worse than fear, the feeling of being seen in a moment you hadn't consented to be seen in. "The outdoor east steps," Dante said. "Yes." "The ones with the rubberized grip coating." She didn't say anything. "The ones we had redone in September specifically because they were slippery." He wasn't accusing her. That was the thing that made it hard. He wasn't performing disbelief, wasn't making a show of seeing through her. He was simply correcting the record, calm and flat and certain, the way a man corrects a statement of fact. "Elena!" Her name in his mouth. This was only the 4th, maybe 5th time she had heard him say it in 7 months. He generally didn't talk to the house staff directly. He worked through Mrs. Albano, the head housekeeper, a compact woman in her 60s who ran the domestic staff like a very quiet general. Elena was 2 levels below anyone Dante Moretti would ordinarily acknowledge, which was precisely why she had taken the job. Invisible. Off the map. Safe. Or so she'd thought. "You want to try again?" he said. "Or you want to stand there and insult us both?" Something in the word us, the presumption of it, the slight, almost offhand intimacy, cracked the story she was holding open just enough. She looked at the floor. The tile was a cool, pale gray, and there was a small chip near the base of the island that she had always noticed when she mopped, a tiny flaw in the otherwise perfect surface. She looked at the chip. "It wasn't on the property," she said quietly. He waited. "It was on the street, outside the east gate." She pressed her lips together, measuring what to give and what to hold. "I went out earlier. After my shift. I needed air." A pause. "Someone was waiting." "Someone," he repeated. "A man named Carver." She said it fast, like pulling a splinter. Get it out before the nerves caught up. "He works for a family called Kellon. He said, my father owes them money, a lot of money. They've been patient," he said, which was a word he seemed to think was funny, and he wanted me to know that their patience was running out. The kitchen was very quiet. Dante hadn't moved. She made herself look up, made herself meet his eyes, because she was done hiding in the floor. She'd spent too long doing that. "He put his hand on my face," she said. "Not to hit me, to hold it. And he told me to pass the message. And then he hit me." The small tightening along Dante's jaw came back. Stayed this time. "How much does your father owe?" 60,000. "How long has he owed it?" 8 months. "And the Kellans, They knew where you worked. Yes. Dante was quiet for what felt like a long time, but she understood now that his silences weren't emptiness. They were calculation, a mechanism working through variables. He moved away from the door, crossed to the far counter, opened a cabinet, and took out a first aid kit. Not the small decorative things she'd seen in the upstairs bathrooms. This was a serious kit, hard-sided, military almost, and he carried it to the island and set it down with the easy familiarity of a man who had used one many times. Sit, he said, nodding toward one of the bar stools on the near side of the island. Mr. Moretti, I don't need... Sit, Elena. She sat. He came around the island and she made herself not lean back, made herself hold still while he stood at an angle to her and opened the kit and took out a cold pack and cracked it between his palms to activate it. The sound was sharp in the quiet kitchen. He wrapped it in a thin cloth from the kit's interior pocket. Precise, methodical, like someone who had developed the habit of doing things correctly the first time because second chances were a luxury he hadn't often had. And he held it out to her. She took it. She put it against her cheek. His eyes dropped to the bruise one more time, and in the second before he neutralized his expression, she saw something move through them. Not pity, not horror. Something colder and more purposeful than either of those things. Something that had an edge to it. When Carver touched your face, he said, his voice perfectly even, was he right-handed? The question was so specific, so immediate, so operational that it took her a second to process it. Yes, I think so. He use a ring? She thought back. The cold of the pack against her bruise made the memory sharper. The feel of knuckles, metal. Yes. Dante nodded very slightly, as though this confirmed something. He closed the first aid kit and set it aside and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, studying her with an attention that should have felt intrusive and instead felt like something she didn't have a word for, like being cataloged by someone who was going to act on the information. Tell me something, he said. The man Carver, he told you he'd been waiting outside the east gate. Yes. How long had he been there? He didn't say, he just said he knew my schedule. The words landed, and she watched Dante receive them, watched his expression do nothing while behind his eyes she could almost see the mechanism accelerating. Your schedule, he said. Yes. Which no one outside this house would have. The silence that followed that had a different quality than the ones before it. Elena felt the cold pack against her cheek. The rain hit the windows. One of the copper pots ticked against its neighbor. She turned the implication over and saw what he was already seeing and felt the floor seem to shift slightly beneath the bar stool. Someone inside the house told him, she said. Not a question. The shape of it had become clear. Someone let him get to the gate in the first place, Dante said. The east perimeter has 3 cameras and a motion alert. If it triggered tonight, I would have been woken. I wasn't. He unfolded his arms. I came down because I heard you in the hall. 30 seconds earlier or later, and this conversation doesn't happen. He looked at her directly. You understand what you've just told me. She understood. She was sitting in the kitchen of a man who ran the most controlled, most secured, most paranoid criminal organization on the eastern seaboard, and she had just told him, by telling him what happened to her, that someone inside that organization had opened a door they were paid to keep shut. The crying maid had found a traitor without meaning to. She set the cold pack down on the counter and looked at him with the clarity of someone who has just understood that the danger they were in was considerably larger than the bruise on their face, and she said the only thing she could think to say. What happens now? Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his dark trousers and took out his phone and started to dial. Now, he said, you tell me everything about your father's debt. Every name, every date, every place you ever met with anyone from the Kellen organization. He put the phone to his ear. And I make a call. She heard the line connect. She heard him speak in a low, steady voice, 3 sentences, no more, and then hang up. He looked back at her. Your father, he said. Where is he tonight? His apartment, in Flushing. Not anymore. He said it without cruelty, without drama, just as a statement of what was now true. He's being moved. You don't need to know where. You just need to know he'll be safe. He set the phone on the counter and picked up the cold pack and handed it back to her with the same methodical precision with which he'd handed it to her the first time. Keep that on your face. Elena took it. Her hand was steadier than it had any right to be. And the traitor, she said. The person inside who let Carver near the gate. Dante looked at her with those still dark eyes, and something moved through them that she would think about for a long time afterward. Not anger, exactly, though there was anger in the foundation of it. Something more deliberate. The expression of a man who had already begun calculating the weight of what needed to happen and was completely, utterly untroubled by the calculation. I'll find them, he said. It was not a boast. It was not a threat made for her benefit. It was a simple statement of scheduled fact, and somehow that was the most frightening thing she had heard all night. Not because it was directed at her, but because she believed it completely, and because believing it meant understanding for the first time that she was not standing in a kitchen with a man who employed her. She was standing in a kitchen with a man who had just claimed her problem as his own. And in the Moretti world, she was beginning to understand, when Dante claimed something, it was never given back. Outside, the rain intensified. Somewhere deep in the east wing of the mansion, a phone began to ring. A landline, low and insistent, and she watched Dante's expression close like a shutter coming down, watched him become something armored and precise, and he looked at her one last time before he moved toward the sound. Don't leave the kitchen, he said. Mr. Moretti, Elena. He stopped at the door, his hand on the frame, and looked back over his shoulder. I said I'd find them. I didn't say it would be clean. He pushed through the door and was gone. She sat on the bar stool in the enormous kitchen, cold pack pressed to her bruise, rain against the windows, and thought about the fact that the lock on the kitchen door was still engaged, the lock he had turned from the inside, and that no one had unlocked it when he left. She was in the safest room in the house, or she was in the only room with no way out. In the Moretti estate, at 3:22 in the morning, Elena Voss was beginning to understand that those might be exactly the same thing, and that somewhere down the east corridor, a phone call was being made that would determine whether the traitor inside these walls would be found before morning, or whether morning would bring something far worse than a locked door. She pressed the cold pack harder against her face. She waited. The landline was still ringing when Dante reached the study. He didn't run. He never ran inside his own house. Running was for men who had lost control of their circumstances, and Dante Moretti had not lost control of his circumstances in 11 years, not since the night his father bled out on the floor of a Bensonhurst social club and left him the keys to an empire that had been built on blood and maintained by something considerably colder than blood. He walked with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who understood that speed and urgency were two entirely different things, and urgency was the enemy of accuracy. He picked up the receiver on the fourth ring. "Talk," he said. The voice on the other end belonged to Marco Vitelli, his night watch captain, a thick-necked man from Queens who had been with the Moretti organization since Dante was 19 and who had earned his position the hard way, which was the only way Dante respected. Marco's voice was low and tight, the specific compression of a man delivering news he knew would land badly. "East Perimeter Camera 3, Marco said. "Someone pulled the feed. Not cut. Pulled." The recording was rerouted to a dead buffer file at 11:47. Whoever did it knew the system architecture. Dante stood at his desk. The study was dark except for the green-shaded lamp on the corner, and in its light his face was all planes and shadow. He set one hand flat on the surface of the desk. "Which means they had access to the server room," he said. "That's a list of 6 people." "Send me the list." "Already did. Check your secure phone." "The buffer file. Can you pull metadata?" "Working on it. Give me 40 minutes." "You have 20. He hung up. He stood in the dark study for exactly 3 seconds, which was the amount of time he allowed himself when the parameters of a problem were shifting beneath his feet. And then he picked up his secure phone and read the list that Marco had sent. 6 names. He read them twice. He recognized all of them. Of course he did. He had personally vetted every one of them, had sat across from each of them at different points in the last 4 years, and made a judgment and been satisfied with that judgment. One of those judgments had been wrong. The thought didn't make him angry, not yet. Anger was something he would have the luxury of later, when the work was done. Right now, it made him careful in a way that was almost surgical, a narrowing of focus that cut away everything that wasn't essential. He pulled up the secondary security panel on his phone, a system that ran parallel to the main estate network, offline, maintained on a private server in a location only 2 people knew, and he checked the internal motion logs for the server room. 1 entry, 11:39 p.m., badge number 07. He cross-referenced the badge number against the list. Felix Rourke. The name sat on the screen of his phone with the quiet weight of a detonator. Felix Rourke, 34, 8 years with the organization, currently head of internal communications, and the man Dante had trusted with the server room access code 2 years ago when the system had been upgraded. A man who had eaten at this table. A man who had stood at Dante's shoulder at 2 funerals and 1 very necessary tribunal in the Bronx and never flinched. Dante put the phone face down on the desk. He needed to move carefully now. The wrong step. Any step taken from anger rather than precision, and Rourke would disappear. Men like Felix Rourke had contingency plans. Men who sold access to their employers' security systems had to, because they understood that discovery was always a possibility, and the only question was how fast they could get out when it came. If Rourke sensed anything wrong before Dante was ready to close the trap, he would be gone before sunrise, and Dante would have an unsolved problem and a compromised perimeter and the Kellen organization knowing they'd drawn blood. He was not going to let that happen. He opened the door of the study and found Nico waiting in the hall. Nico Ferrante, 26, the youngest member of his inner security detail, a lean and serious young man from Staten Island who had the particular quality Dante prized most in the people closest to him, which was the ability to listen without adding anything unnecessary. Dante had sent for him via text 30 seconds after leaving the kitchen. Nico was here because Dante had told him to be here, which meant Nico was exactly where he was supposed to be, which meant Nico was one of 5 people in this building who Dante was currently prepared to trust. "Walk with me," Dante said. They moved through the corridor toward the east wing, 2 men in the dark of a rain-soaked mansion at 3:30 in the morning, and Dante spoke in a voice calibrated to carry exactly as far as Nico's ear. "Felix Rourke," he said. "Where is he right now?" Nico didn't hesitate. "Staff quarters, 3rd floor east. He checked in at midnight per protocol." "Is he still in his room?" "I'd need to check the—" "Then check." Nico pulled out his phone and typed a rapid message to someone Dante didn't need to know the name of. 30 seconds passed. The corridor was cold, and the rain was loud against the east-facing windows, and Dante walked without hurrying and waited for the answer the way he waited for everything, with the specific patience of a man who has decided that the answer is already determined, and the waiting is just the interval before confirmation. Nico's phone buzzed. He read the screen. "Room light is on," he said, and his keycard was used 15 minutes ago to access the 1st-floor supply corridor. Dante stopped walking. The supply corridor connected to the staff exit, which connected to the service road that ran along the east boundary of the property. Not the main gate, the service exit. The one with a single guard post that rotated shifts at 3:45 a.m. "He's moving," Dante said. Not running yet, not panicking, but moving, which meant one of 2 things. Either Rourke was being cautious for reasons unrelated to tonight, covering routine tracks, or something had signaled to him in the last 15 minutes that the tide was turning. And the only thing that had changed in the last 15 minutes was a phone call Dante had made to Marco. A call placed from a landline that ran through the estate's internal exchange, an exchange that Felix Rourke had access to. "North exit," Dante said. "Now. Don't run. Don't put your hand on your weapon until I tell you." They changed direction. The north exit of the Moretti estate opened onto a gravel path that curved behind the garage block and joined the service road 200 meters east of the supply corridor exit. It was shorter, and it was not on any route that Felix Rourke would be watching, because Felix Rourke thought he had tonight's advantage, thought he had bought himself a window by rerouting a camera feed and waiting until a Tuesday night when the main security complement was running at 60% due to a scheduled maintenance rotation that he himself had helped plan. He had made a calculation. He had made it carefully, probably. And it was about to be wrong. They went out the north exit into the rain. The gravel was wet and the grass beyond it was soaked, and the cold came in off the Long Island Sound 2 miles distant and hit them both in the face like something unfriendly. Dante barely registered it. He moved along the path behind the garage block with Nico 2 steps to his right, and they came around the corner of the second garage bay and stopped in the shadow of the wall. And 30 seconds later, the supply corridor door opened, and Felix Rourke stepped out into the rain. He was carrying a bag, not large, a soft duffel, the kind that could hold a change of clothes and a laptop, and whatever documents a man thought he needed when he was leaving a job under conditions that didn't include a severance package. He had his collar up against the rain, and he was moving fast, not quite running, but close, his head down, his breath coming in small clouds. Dante said his name, not loudly, barely above a conversational volume. He said it the way you say a familiar name in an ordinary room, and the normalcy of it in the abnormal dark stopped Felix Rourke as effectively as a wall. He turned around. The look on his face in the thin light from the garage's exterior lamp lasted only a fraction of a second before the professional surface came back down over it, but Dante had spent his entire adult life reading the fraction of a second looks that preceded the professional surface, and what he read in Felix Rourke's face in that fraction of a second was not surprise. It was resignation. The specific hollow settling of a man who had run his probability calculations and arrived at the worst outcome, and somehow, beneath all the fear, was not entirely unprepared for it. That was almost more telling than the bag. "Mr. Moretti," Felix said. His voice was steady. Dante had to give him that. "Felix!" Dante moved out of the shadow of the garage wall. The rain hit his shoulders, his hair, and he let it. "Where are you going?" "My mother." The answer came fast, too practiced to be spontaneous. "She called earlier. She's not well. I was going to... at 3:30 in the morning with a packed bag." Felix stopped talking. Nico had moved to the right, positioning himself between Rourke and the service road, and Rourke's eyes tracked the movement and then came back to Dante with the look of a man recalculating the exit options and finding them closed. "Badge 07, Dante said. "Server room, 1139. The professional surface cracked at the edges. Rourke's jaw tightened. He set the bag down on the wet gravel. Slowly, without being asked, the gesture of a man choosing cooperation over confrontation when the confrontation math had stopped working in his favor. "I can explain it," Rourke said. "I know you can. The question is whether you're going to explain it accurately or whether you're going to spend the first 10 minutes of this conversation testing my patience." Dante stopped 4 feet from him. The rain came down between them. "I've already had a difficult night, Felix. I would sincerely prefer the accurate version." Something moved through Rourke's face. A complex thing, a calculation weighing consequences on both sides of a very narrow ledge. Then he exhaled through his nose, a long, slow breath that steamed in the cold air, and disappeared. "The Kellens," he said. "How long?" 4 months. "How much?" Rourke looked at the ground. "They had something on me." He said it to the wet gravel. "From before I came to work for you. A situation in Philadelphia. They had documentation." "How much?" Dante said again, and the repetition was a door that only opened one way. Rourke looked up. 80,000, plus the gate access. They wanted 2 things, the money and someone they could use to move product through the East Corridor without triggering our checks. Dante was quiet. The rain was loud. Nico to the right was very still. "They used the access to bring someone to my gate tonight," Dante said. "A man named Carver." Something shifted in Rourke's face that was different from what had come before. Not shame, exactly. Something more complicated. A man discovering that the size of what he'd agreed to had been larger than what he'd been told it was. "I didn't know about anyone coming to the gate," he said. "I gave them the corridor access schedule and the camera rotation. I didn't know they were sending anyone." "Then you weren't paying attention to what you were selling." Rourke had no answer for that. There was no answer for that. "The woman," Dante said. "The maid, Elena Voss. Did they ask you about her specifically?" A pause. A small one, but Dante caught it. "They asked about the live-in staff schedules," Rourke said carefully. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Rourke's hands had dropped to his sides, loose, the duffel bag sitting on the gravel between his feet, the rain soaking through the shoulders of his jacket. They asked if there was anyone on staff with a family debt, someone with pressure points. He swallowed. I told them about the Voss girl, her father's situation. I heard about it from Mrs. Albano 3 months ago. I told them. The silence that followed had texture. Dante was aware of his own breathing, the steadiness of it, the control it took to keep it that way. He was also aware of the rain on his face and the gravel under his feet, and the bag between Felix Rourke's feet, and the 8 years this man had spent eating at his table. And the money from my private accounts, Dante said. Rourke flinched. A small flinch, but a real one. I accessed the routing codes through the server room, he said. 1147 was the camera redirect. The transfer, that was separate, about 3 weeks ago. How much did you take? 60,000. 60,000. The number landed like something dropped from a height. Elena's father's debt to the Kellens was 60,000. Felix Rourke had stolen 60,000 from Dante's private accounts, and the Kellens had used that access to send a man to terrorize a maid over a debt that equaled the exact amount their inside man had taken from his employer. And none of it was coincidence, none of it was separate. It was a single mechanism, a chain of leverage and betrayal that Dante was only now seeing in its complete geometry. They were going to pin the theft on her, Dante said. It wasn't a question. The shape of it was becoming clear. Use her father's debt as the story. Make it look like she was skimming to pay what he owed. Rourke said nothing, which was an answer. Set her up to take the fall, clear themselves out, and leave me burning down my own house looking for a maid who had nothing to do with it. Dante moved his jaw slightly. Elegant. For Kellens. I didn't know they were going to go. Stop. The word came out flat and hard, and Rourke stopped immediately. Every time you tell me what you didn't know, you're telling me what you chose not to know. That's not a defense, Felix. That's a description of the choices you made. Rourke had nothing left to put up against that. He stood in the rain with his bag at his feet and his collar soaked through and his face doing nothing because there was nothing left to do with it. He had run the numbers and arrived here, and here was what there was. What happens now, he said. It came out flat, not quite a question. Now you come inside, Dante said, and you tell me everything about the Kellen organization that you know, the contact's name, the location they used for exchanges, every communication you had and how you had it. He turned back toward the north exit. Everything, Felix, because the only leverage you have right now is information, and the window on that leverage is very short. Rourke picked up his bag. He followed. Nico fell into step 3 feet behind him, close enough to feel but not touching, the specific geometry of a man who is being walked somewhere rather than choosing to go. Back inside, the warmth of the house was immediate and strange after the rain, and Dante moved them through the service passage to a room off the north corridor that he used for conversations that didn't need witnesses beyond the walls. A small room, table, 4 chairs, no windows, a single overhead light that came on fluorescent and unforgiving. He sat Rourke in the chair opposite the door. He stood. For the next 40 minutes, Felix Rourke talked. He talked about a man named Lenny Briggs, the Kellen organization's internal accountant and primary coordinator for their debt operations, a name Dante filed away behind his eyes with a precision that was almost physical. He talked about a warehouse in Greenpoint that the Kellens used for enforcement meetings, and a second location in Sunset Park that handled their financing. He talked about how the communications had worked, a messaging app that auto-deleted, a rotating series of burner phones, a pickup system for cash that used parking structures in Midtown. Dante let him talk. He didn't interrupt. He didn't take notes, not in front of Rourke, but he retained everything with the specific, trained memory of a man who had understood from a young age that written records were a liability and a good memory was the most secure storage system available. When Rourke was done, the room was quiet except for the rain still hitting the roof and the fluorescent hum above them. The 60,000 you took from my accounts, Dante said. Did you spend it? Rourke shook his head. It's in a separate account, untouched. I can give you the routing information. You'll give me access to the account entirely. Tonight. Yes. Dante looked at him for a long moment, Rourke held the look as long as he could and then dropped his eyes. "You've been with me 8 years," Dante said. Rourke said nothing. "You sat at my table. You were at my father's burial." A pause. "You handed me a flag." The silence stretched. It wasn't the silence of a man waiting for an answer. It was the silence of a man marking the record, establishing, for his own purposes, the precise weight of the thing that had been broken, so that its absence going forward would be correctly measured. "I want you to know," Dante said, "that the reason you're in this room instead of on that service road is because of the information, not because of 8 years, not because of the flag, because of what you just told me, which I can use." He pulled out a chair on his side of the table and sat down, elbows on the surface, studying the man across from him with those still dark eyes. "When I'm done using it, we'll have a different conversation." Rourke understood what that meant. He understood it completely. He sat very still in his chair with his hands flat on the table and his wet jacket steaming slightly in the warmth of the room, and he looked like what he was, a man who had made a calculation that had cost him everything and was now waiting for the accounting. Dante stood. He went to the door and opened it and found Marco Vitelli waiting in the corridor. He'd texted him from outside. Marco was a broad, quiet man who communicated primarily through small shifts of expression and an economy of movement that came from 30 years of professional discipline, and right now his expression communicated that he had been briefed and was ready. "Stay with him," Dante said. "Get the account access. Get everything he has on the messaging system. I want screenshots. I want numbers. I want whatever's left before the auto-delete cycles." He looked at Marco squarely. "He cooperates fully." "Understood," Marco said, and there was a particular weight in the single word that told Felix Rourke, who could hear it from where he sat, everything he needed to know about what fully meant. Dante left the room. He walked back through the north corridor, through the service passage, through the main hall. He stopped at the door of the kitchen. It was still locked. He unlocked it and pushed it open. Elena was sitting on the bar stool exactly where he had left her. The cold pack had warmed and she was holding it loosely in both hands, and when the door opened, she straightened with the automatic caution of someone whose body had been wired to treat unexpected sounds as threats. And then she saw it was him, and the straightening became something less defensive but no less tense. She had not cried again while he was gone. He noticed that. The bruise on her cheek had darkened in the last hour, and her eyes were clear and dry, and watching him with an alertness that hadn't been there in the first minutes after he'd found her. "Your father is in transit," he said. "He'll be at a secure facility in New Jersey by 5 a.m. He's not being told why. He's just being moved." She absorbed this. "Does he know it's you?" "He knows he's safe. That's enough for tonight." She looked down at the cold pack in her hands. Her knuckles were white around it. "Did you find who—" "Yes." A breath. Small, involuntary. "Who?" "Someone I trusted." He said it as a fact without elaboration, in the tone of a man who had filed something under a specific category and closed the drawer. "It doesn't change anything for you except that the threat from the Kellens now has a shape. I know who their contact was. I know their locations." He moved to the counter and stood with his back to it, arms crossed, watching her with an attention that was different now. Less assessment, more something he didn't entirely have a name for, which was a rare enough condition that he noticed it. "The debt your father owes. What's the original amount? Before interest?" 40,000, she said. "He borrowed 40 and they've been adding to it." "The 60,000 figure Carver gave you was, where did it come from?" She frowned slightly. "He said that was the current total, with penalties." "It isn't," Dante said. "The 60,000 they were demanding from you corresponds exactly to the amount their inside man took from my private accounts." He watched her process this, watched the frown deepen into understanding, watched the moment she arrived at the conclusion. They weren't collecting a debt. They were recovering funds they'd already stolen from me and using your father's situation as the vehicle. Kills two problems with one action. She stared at him. The cold pack was motionless in her hands. "They were going to make it look like I stole from you," she said. "Weren't they?" "Yes." The words sat in the kitchen between them. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. still there, but quieter, moving from assault to presence. And in the relative quiet, the kitchen felt smaller and more enclosed. The copper pot still, the fluorescent hum of the refrigerator, the only sound. "The man who helped them," she said carefully. "Is he still in the house?" "For now." She heard the precision in that and chose not to press it. Instead, she set the cold pack on the island surface and put both hands flat on either side of it, and looked at Dante with an expression he hadn't seen on her face in 7 months of peripheral encounters, an expression that had nothing of the careful invisibility of the live-in maid in it at all. "What do you need from me?" she said. The question surprised him. He'd expected fear. He'd expected gratitude, or the complicated species of resentment that sometimes looks like gratitude. He hadn't expected that. The flat, practical, almost professional directness of a woman who had decided to stop managing her own smallness and ask the operational question. "For now, nothing," he said. "Stay in the house. Don't contact anyone. Not friends, not your father's neighbors, no one who might have a connection to the Kellen network." He paused. "Do you have a phone?" "In my room." "Which carrier?" She told him. He nodded. "Keep it off until morning. We don't know yet whether the Kellens have anyone positioned on the outside who might be monitoring outgoing calls from this address." He uncrossed his arms and pushed off from the counter. "You should sleep." "I won't," she said. "No," he agreed. "Probably not." He moved toward the door. His hand found the frame the same way it had when he'd left earlier, and he stopped the same way and looked back. The kitchen light was sharp on the bruise on her cheek and on the steadiness of her posture and on the hand still flat on the island surface. "Elena." She looked at him. "The man who hit you," he said. "Carver. He'll be found." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to do that." "I know," Dante said. "I'm telling you." He left the kitchen. In the corridor, moving toward the study and the work that was going to occupy him until dawn, he was 3 steps from the kitchen door when his secure phone buzzed with a message from Marco. He read it. He stopped walking. The message was 4 words, second transfer, not Rourke. He read it again. His thumb moved to the call button. Marco picked up on the first ring. "Explain," Dante said. "I got into the server's full access log," Marco said, and his voice was the compressed version again, tight with something that was not quite controlled. There were 2 entries to the private accounts. The first was Rourke, 3 weeks ago, 60,000, clean, traceable. He admitted it. A pause. The second entry was 6 days ago, different badge, different routing, another 30,000 moved to a different account than Rourke's. Whoever did it used a ghost credential, something built off an existing badge but altered, high-level system knowledge. Dante stood in the dark corridor. The rain was almost gone now, just a whisper against the windows. "Rourke couldn't have built a ghost credential," he said. His voice was very flat. "That requires someone with deeper architecture access." "Yes," Marco said, "which means there are 2 of them." "Yes." Dante stood with the phone against his ear and looked at the wall in front of him and understood that the problem he had believed he had contained in a room off the north corridor with Marco Vitelli sitting across from it had just become a different and considerably larger problem, because the man in that room had told him everything he knew, and what he knew was only half the picture. Somewhere in this house, there was a second person, someone with deeper access than Felix Rourke. Someone who had let Rourke take the visible risk and had worked behind him quietly 6 days ago, moving money and leaving a trail so clean that Marco had only found it now, digging 4 layers into a log that most people in the organization didn't know existed. Someone who had been invisible, just like the maid. And the thought arrived in Dante's mind with the cold, clean clarity of something very dangerous. Whoever it is, they know I found Rourke. And if they know the system as well as this log suggests they do, they know it happened in the last hour, which means the window to find them is closing right now, in real time, with every second he stood in this corridor. "Lock down the server room," he said into the phone. "No badge access for anyone until I clear it personally, and Marco," he was already moving. "Wake every lieutenant in this house, every single one, now." He hung up. He was moving fast now, not running, but close. And the mansion that had been quiet and sleeping an hour ago was about to stop being either of those things because the trap he'd thought he was setting had a second spring in it that he hadn't seen, and somewhere in the 4,200 square feet of this estate was someone who had been planning very carefully for a very long time. He was halfway to the main security hub when his secure phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen. The message was from a number he didn't recognize. It said, "You found the wrong one, Moretti. Ask your second lieutenant where he was at midnight." Dante read it once. His jaw set. His thumb moved to forward the message to Marco before the sender could think to erase it from whatever channel they'd used. Then he looked up and started to walk toward the east wing where his second lieutenant, a man named Caruso Vane, who had been with the organization for 6 years and who Dante had promoted 11 months ago and handed the keys to the internal communications protocol. The lights went out. Not gradually, not a flicker. All at once, every light in the main house killed at the breaker, plunging the corridor into a darkness so complete that for a half second Dante's eyes found nothing to work with, just the faint gray rectangle of a window 20 feet down the hall and the rain that had almost stopped but hadn't quite, and somewhere in the darkness, very close, the sound of a door. Opening, not closing. Someone was already moving. Dante moved toward the sound of the door, not toward the window. Not toward the emergency panel at the end of the corridor that would restore auxiliary power in 40 seconds if he hit the manual override. Toward the door, because the door was information, whoever had opened it knew the layout of this floor in the dark, which narrowed the list, and the direction of the sound put it somewhere between the East Corridor junction and the secondary stairwell that led up to the third-floor staff quarters. Where Felix Rourke had a room. Where Caruso Vane had a room. He moved with one hand trailing the wall, not for balance but for reference, keeping his position mapped against the architecture he knew better than he knew most faces. The carpet runner. The marble threshold at the junction. The 4 inches of height difference between the main corridor floor and the East Wing addition. A construction irregularity from 1987 that every member of the household staff knew to step over and that someone unfamiliar with the house would not. He felt the threshold under his foot and stepped over it without breaking pace. His phone was in his left hand. He didn't use the flashlight. The light would announce him before he could see anything useful. He kept it dark and moved by feel and listened to the house the way his father had taught him to listen to rooms before he was old enough to understand why the lesson mattered. The sound came again. Closer. Footsteps on the secondary stairwell. Not running, but moving with purpose. Moving fast enough to be urgent and carefully enough to suggest someone who was managing their own fear rather than being driven by it. Dante reached the base of the stairwell and stopped. He heard breathing above him, 1 flight up, maybe less. "Vane," he said. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed had a specific quality. The quality of a person who has just understood that the variable they built their plan around, the darkness, the disorientation, the 40 seconds before the auxiliary power came back, had been neutralized by a single word spoken in a calm voice at the base of a staircase. Dante heard the small sounds of recalculation happening above him in the dark, the shift of weight, the minute adjustment of a foot on a stair. "Come down," Dante said. Nothing for 3 seconds. Then, from above, "I heard the lights go out and I was checking Caruso." The name came out quiet and absolute. "Come down the stairs." A pause, then footsteps on the stairs, descending, and Dante stepped back 2 paces to give himself room and kept his phone in his left hand and his right hand loose at his side. The auxiliary power came on. Not full brightness, just the emergency strips along the floor, pale blue-white lines that turned the stairwell into something underwater and strange. And in that light, Caruso Vane came down the last 4 steps and stopped on the landing. He was a compact man, 41, with a face that had always struck Dante as professionally neutral. Not blank, but calibrated. The face of a man who had learned early that expressions were a form of currency and spent them sparingly. He was dressed in dark clothes, which was either coincidence or wasn't, and he was holding nothing in his hands, which Dante noted. He looked at Dante. He looked at Dante's right hand, loose, not on a weapon, and something in his face processed this and arrived at a conclusion that was not relief. The text came from a number I don't recognize, Dante said. It told me to ask where you were at midnight. Vane said nothing. His jaw was set. So I'm asking. Here, Vane said. In the house. I was here. Doing what? Sleeping. Until the lights... The server log shows a ghost credential, Dante said. Built off an existing badge, but altered. High-level architecture knowledge. Not Rourke. Rourke didn't have the depth for it. He watched Vane's face. You do. Vane's chin came up slightly. A small movement, barely perceptible, but Dante had been watching that face for 6 years, and he knew every degree of its calibration. A ghost credential could be built by anyone with access to the credential management system. Which is 4 people, Dante said. Myself, Marco, the system administrator who is currently in Tampa at his mother's 80th birthday and has been there since Saturday with his phone pinging cell towers the whole time. He paused. And you. The emergency lighting hummed. Somewhere in the house, movement. Marco or Nico or the lieutenants being woken. The machinery of the organization beginning to respond. They had perhaps 3 minutes before this stairwell had witnesses. The 30,000, Dante said. Routed 6 days ago to an account that isn't Rourke's. I want to know where it went. Vane looked at him steadily. He was doing the same calculation Rourke had done, running the numbers on the ledge he was standing on, measuring the distances on either side. But where Rourke had arrived at cooperation, what Dante read in Caruso Vane's face was something different. Not the hollow resignation of a man who had been caught and knew it. Something that looked in the strange blue light, almost like relief. You should know, Vane said, that the 30,000 is the least of it. Dante went very still. Tell me, he said. Vane looked at the wall to his left. His hands were still empty at his sides. When he looked back, his face had changed. The calibration was gone. The professional neutral surface had dropped away, and what was underneath it was something raw and older and more complicated than Dante had been prepared for. The Kellans didn't approach me, he said. I approached them. The sentence landed in the stairwell and sat there. 4 months ago, Vane continued, his voice flat and precise, the voice of a man delivering a deposition. I made contact through a third party in Sunset Park. I gave them Rourke as a starting point, someone they could use, someone with a pressure point I already knew about. Philadelphia. He paused. I set him up to be the visible layer, the one you'd find. Dante said nothing. He was listening with his whole body, cataloging every word, every pause, the exact quality of Vane's voice. The ghost credential was mine, Vane said. The 30,000 went to a holding account in the Caymans, but the money was never the point. He looked directly at Dante now, and in his eyes was something that Dante finally recognized. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has decided, consciously or not, that he is done carrying it. The point was the access. The Kellans needed a way into your financial routing, not to steal, to map, to understand the flow well enough to replicate it. Replicate it, Dante said. They're building a parallel operation, Vane said, not to compete with you, to replace you. The plan isn't a takeover, it's a substitution. They spend 12 months mapping every financial route you use, every enforcement contact, every debt relationship in the 5 boroughs. Then they remove you and step into the exact space you occupied, and nobody in the network even notices the transition because everything looks the same. The words fell into the stairwell one by one, and Dante received them with the stillness of a man standing on ice that is cracking under his feet, and has decided that movement in any direction is equally dangerous, and therefore the only option is perfect stillness. You gave them the map, Dante said. Over 4 months. In pieces. How much of it? Vane's eyes held his. Enough. The word was a door closing. Dante heard it close. He asked the question he didn't want to ask, the question that the whole shape of this conversation had been pointing at since Vane said I approached them and the ground shifted. Why? He said. Vane was quiet for a moment, the hum of the emergency lighting, the house creaking in the aftermath of the rain. Then, your father made a promise to my father in 1998, specific, documented. When my father died, that promise transferred to you by the terms of the original agreement. He paused. You buried the agreement 18 months ago. I found out 8 months ago. Dante looked at him. I went to you directly, Vane said. And now there was something in his voice that had an edge. Not anger, exactly, but the ghost of anger that has been living in the house long enough to become furniture. You told me the document didn't exist. You told me my father had misremembered the terms. I was sitting across from you at that table, and you looked me in the face, and you lied to me. The stairwell was very quiet. And then I made a decision, Vane said. Dante's jaw moved. He looked at the floor for precisely 2 seconds, and then back up. And when he came back up, his face was the face that people who dealt with him professionally feared most. Not the cold anger, not the calculated threat, but the complete and utter absence of anything. The expression of a man who had received information that has changed the geometry of a situation and is now purely, clinically engaged with what the new geometry requires. The promise my father made, he said. 40% of the Flushing territory on the occasion of my father's death, Vane said, witnessed by 2 men who are both dead now, which I don't think was an accident. The witnesses died of natural causes. One of them was 53. Silence. The Kellens, Dante said, they know about the promise. I told them. It was leverage I used to establish credibility when I first made contact. Proof that I had real grievance, not just money problems. He said it without apology, as a statement of methodology. They were more interested in the routing maps than the territory dispute, but they used the promise as confirmation that I was genuine. Dante took this in. He took all of it in. The 4 months, the systematic dismantling of his financial privacy, the setup of Felix Rourke as a decoy, the use of Elena's father's debt as a mechanism, the ghost credential, the 30,000, and underneath all of it like a foundation crack that had been spreading unseen for 18 months. The broken promise and the dead witnesses and the man standing 6 feet from him in the blue emergency light who had decided that if the system wouldn't give him what was owed, he would burn the system down from the inside. How much have you given them? Dante said. Specifically. Routes, contacts, accounts, Vane told him. He told him in the same flat, precise voice he'd used for everything else. And as he spoke, Dante felt the scale of it settle onto him with a weight that was almost physical. Not catastrophic. Not yet. But large. Large enough that the work of containing it was going to be significant, and the window for that containment was narrow. The Kellens had enough of his network's architecture to begin substitution operations within weeks if he didn't move to restructure, and restructuring at speed without tipping off the parts of the network he needed to protect was going to require the kind of precision that left no room for error. He had no room for error and a wounded operation and a traitor who had just inexplicably told him everything. That last part was the part that didn't fit, and Dante was never comfortable with things that didn't fit. Why are you telling me this? He said. Vane looked at him. The relief that Dante had seen in his face earlier had settled into something calmer. Because they're going to kill you, he said. The substitution plan. It's not abstract. There's a timeline. The warehouse meeting in Brooklyn, the one Lenny Briggs is going to call in the next 48 hours under the pretext of a debt negotiation. That's the execution point. They're not coming to negotiate. They're coming to finish it. Dante looked at him for a long time. The emergency lighting hummed. You came to warn me, Dante said. I came down the stairs when the lights went out because I heard you in the corridor and I made a decision. Vane's hands, still at his sides, tightened once and then released. I've been making a different decision every day for 4 months. Tonight I made this one. That doesn't restore what you took from me. No, Vane said. It doesn't. It doesn't ungive them the routing maps. No. It doesn't bring back the access I've lost or the months I'm going to spend restructuring to compensate for what you handed them. Dante's voice was level throughout. Not forgiving, not furious. Something more precise than either. You understand that? Yes. Then you understand that what you've just done is tell me everything you know and hand me the weapon and stand in front of it. Vane's face was steady. I understand. Dante stood in the blue light and looked at the man who had worked for him for 6 years and eaten at his table and handed him real information and real betrayal in the same breath. And he felt something that he rarely felt. and recognized it precisely because of its rarity. He felt the situation exceed his prepared responses and demand something improvised, something he was going to have to build in real time from components he hadn't pre-assembled. The door at the top of the stairwell opened and Nico appeared at the top of the stairs, and behind him the shape of another man, and Dante held up one hand without looking and Nico stopped. "Two things," Dante said to Vane. "The Kellens? Do they know you're here right now, in this conversation?" "No." "Do they know the lights went out?" "They don't have anyone inside the house. Rourke was their inside contact and he was handling mechanical access only. Gates, cameras. They have no eyes inside the building. Which means, as far as they know, their plan is intact." Vane looked at him steadily. "Yes." Dante let a silence sit for 3 seconds. Then, as far as they're going to know, it stays intact. Vane absorbed this. Something shifted in his face. A small recalibration. The face of a man who has been looking at a firing squad and is being told to look somewhere else and doesn't yet trust the instruction. "You're going to use me," Vane said. "I'm going to use what you know," Dante said, "which means keeping you exactly where you are, doing exactly what they expect you to do until I need you to do something specific." He moved toward the base of the stairs. "Which means Rourke can't know about this conversation. Which means Marco can't know the full picture. Which means you're going to walk back to your room and get 3 hours of sleep, and tomorrow you're going to function normally. And the only deviation from normal is that you're going to tell me the moment Briggs makes contact about the Brooklyn meeting." Vane looked at him. The thing that moved through his face in that moment was complicated, and Dante didn't try to categorize it. "And after Brooklyn?" "After Brooklyn," Dante said, "we'll have the conversation about my father's promise." It was not amnesty. It was not forgiveness. It was the specific surgical offer of a man who needed a tool and was stating the price of the tool's use in terms that were precise enough to be binding and narrow enough to contain nothing warm. Vane heard the difference. He was smart enough to hear it. He nodded once. He went back up the stairs. Dante watched him go, watched the door at the top close behind him, and then stood alone in the blue emergency light for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he looked up at Nico, who was still at the top of the stairs with the second man behind him. "Get the power back on," he said. "Tell the lieutenants it was a breaker fault, maintenance issue. Nothing more." He started up the stairs. "And get me Marco, privately, server room, 5 minutes." Nico moved to comply without a word, the specific quality of his silence indicating that he had heard enough to understand that questions were not the appropriate response, which was precisely why Dante kept him close. In the server room, Marco was waiting. The overhead light was on, bright and clinical, and the server racks hummed along the walls with the sound of 1,000 small processes running in parallel. And Marco had the expression of a man who had been holding tightly to the shape of a problem and was about to be told the shape was wrong. Dante told him enough. Not everything. Not the promise. Not the decision he'd made at the base of the stairwell about Vane. Enough to explain why the Kellen threat was larger than Rourke alone, and why the Brooklyn meeting was the critical point, and why the next 48 hours required the organization to operate as though nothing had changed while internally restructuring the most exposed financial routes. Marco listened. He had the quality, which Dante valued above almost everything else in the people around him, of listening without interjecting, taking in the information and letting it settle and processing it completely before responding. When Dante was done, Marco was quiet for 7 seconds. "The routing maps they have," Marco said. "How deep?" "Deep enough to require full restructuring of the Eastern accounts and the 3 Midtown debt channels." A pause. "The Greenpoint operation stays intact. They don't have the Greenpoint architecture. So we have a protected base to work from. We have a starting point." Marco nodded. He said what Dante had known he would say, because Marco was a man who had spent 30 years understanding what a situation required and saying it without decoration. "It's going to be tight." "Yes." "The Brooklyn meeting, if they're planning what Vane said, they'll have people positioned outside it. We walk in underprepared and we don't walk out." "We're not walking in underprepared. How are we going to know the layout?" Dante looked at him. "We're going to know," he said, "because someone inside the meeting is going to tell us." Marco looked back at him for a moment, and the calculation behind his eyes ran to its conclusion, and his expression said that he understood without needing it spelled out, and he accepted it with the particular equanimity of a man who has made his peace with the fact that the operations he is part of are sometimes built from materials that don't feel clean. "Then we have a window," Marco said. "A narrow one. When do we start moving the accounts?" "Tonight, quietly. Move the 3 most exposed channels first. I want them dark before sunrise. Reroute through the Greenpoint base using the secondary codes. Anyone who asks gets told it's a routine security rotation." "And Rourke? He's still in the north room." "He stays there. He's cooperating, and I need his communication channels to the Kellens intact and quiet for another 48 hours. After Brooklyn, his situation changes." Marco nodded. He understood what his situation changes meant in the same way that Vane had understood what "we'll have a different conversation" meant. Not because the words were explicit, but because 30 years of working in the same room as the way things work had given him a fluent literacy in what was left unsaid. "One more thing," Dante said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his secure phone and opened the message from the unknown number. "You found the wrong one, Moretti. Ask your second lieutenant where he was at midnight," and held the screen out to Marco. "The number that sent this, I need it traced." Marco took the phone and looked at the screen. "This is from inside the house network," he said. "I know." "Which means whoever sent it had access to the internal exchange." He looked up. At the same time, the external cameras were rerouted. "Same window," Dante confirmed. 11:40 to midnight. Marco was quiet for a second. "The text told you about Vane?" "Yes." "But it came from inside the house." "Yes." "Which means—" Marco stopped. He went through the logic a second time. Dante watched him arrive at the same place Dante had arrived and seen the problem that lived there. "Someone sent you to Vane deliberately," Marco said, "on purpose, knowing you'd find him." "Which either means someone wanted Vane found," Dante said, "or someone wanted me looking at Vane instead of somewhere else." The server room hummed. Marco held the phone and looked at the number on the screen, and the quality of his silence had shifted into something different from before. Not the silence of a man processing information, but the silence of a man looking at a door and understanding for the first time that he doesn't know what's on the other side of it. "Who else knew about the ghost credential?" Marco said. "At the time I found it, you and me. And now, you, me, and whoever sent this text." Marco looked at him steadily. "I didn't send this text." "I know," Dante said. He took the phone back. He stood in the server room with its humming racks and its bright light, and the weight of 48 hours sitting on him like architecture. And he thought about Elena Voss in the kitchen with a bruised face and steady hands asking, "What do you need from me?" And he thought about Rourke in the north room, and Vane in his room on the 3rd floor, and a Brooklyn warehouse, and the substitution plan, and the routing maps, and a dead witness who had been 53 years old. And at the bottom of all of it, beneath the operational urgency and the restructuring and the trap he was going to have to set with borrowed tools, he felt something he almost never felt. He felt that the board he was playing on was larger than the board he could see. And then his phone buzzed. Not the secure phone. The regular line. The number that almost no one had. The one he kept for genuine emergencies. He looked at the screen. The number was Elena Voss's number. The one she'd told him was turned off. He answered. Her voice came through with the specific compression of someone speaking very quietly in a room where sound could carry. "I know you told me to stay in the kitchen," she said. "I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening." "There's a man in the house," she said. "He's not staff. I don't know how he got in. He's been in the East Gallery for the last 20 minutes, and he has a phone to his ear, and he keeps saying your name." Dante's hand tightened on the phone. His eyes went to Marco. "Elena," he said, very carefully. "Which gallery? East ground or East upper?" "Ground," she said. "The one with the paintings. I saw him through the gap in the door when I came out of the kitchen to find you." A pause, short and controlled, and beneath the control he could hear the specific quality of breathing that belongs to someone who is frightened and refusing to be governed by it. "He has a gun, in his right hand, not pointed at anything yet, just held." The man in the gallery with a gun and Dante's name on his lips, who had gotten inside a lockdown estate through a perimeter that Rourke had compromised, and that Dante had believed in the last hour he had contained. The Kellans hadn't waited for Brooklyn. They had moved the timeline. And the only person who knew there was a man in the gallery. The only person positioned between that man and the rest of the house was a maid with a bruised face who had been told to stay in the kitchen and had instead come out to find the person she thought should know. "Elena," Dante said. His voice was completely level. "Go back to the kitchen. Lock the door from the inside. Do not open it for anyone until I knock twice and say your name." A beat of silence. Then, "There's a second man," she said. "He just came through the gallery door from the garden side. They're together." 2 men, inside the perimeter, armed, in the ground floor gallery 20 feet from the main staircase that connected to every floor of the house. Dante was already moving. "Kitchen," he said. "Now, lock the door." He heard the line go quiet. Not disconnected, just silent. The sound of someone moving fast and not talking while they did it. And then the soft click of a lock engaging, and he said her name once more to confirm, and she said, "Locked," in a voice that was barely a breath. And he ended the call and looked at Marco with an expression that contained everything the situation was, and nothing that wasn't operationally relevant. "2 men," he said. "East gallery, ground floor, armed." He was moving for the door. "Get Nico. Tell him East gallery, quiet approach, no shooting unless I give the word. I need one of them alive." Marco was already reaching for his radio. Dante went into the corridor and moved toward the east wing, and the house that had been slowly, carefully coming back under his control in the last 2 hours revealed itself in that moment as something that had never fully been his to begin with. A stage on which other people had been moving pieces he hadn't seen, in the dark, patient and deliberate, while he was finding Rourke and confronting Vane and believing, in the way that even careful men sometimes believe, that the trap he was setting was the only trap in the room. He was 30 feet from the gallery door when he heard, through the wall, the sound of something being moved. A piece of furniture, heavy, dragged across the parquet floor with the specific purpose of someone establishing a position. They weren't just inside the house, they were setting up, which meant they intended to wait for Dante to come to them, or wait for a specific moment, a signal, a confirmation from someone inside the organization that the primary target was in a known location at a known time, and the thought arrived with the cold clarity of a conclusion that couldn't be avoided. The 2 men in the gallery were not acting alone, and the person who had positioned them was not Felix Rourke, who was locked in a room, and was not Caruso Vane, who had spent the last 30 minutes being useful in a stairwell. The text that had sent Dante to Vane. The ghost credential that required deep system access. The second transfer that Marco had found buried 4 layers into the log. The unknown number from inside the house network. Dante stopped walking. He stood in the corridor outside the east gallery with his hand 2 inches from the door and the sound of furniture being positioned on the other side, and the weight of a realization settling over him that was, in his adult professional life, the closest thing he had experienced to the specific cold vertigo of the ground moving. There was a third person. Not Rourke, not Vane. Someone who had used both of them. Someone who had built the ghost credential and planted the text and positioned the men in the gallery, and had been inside his organization long enough and deep enough to do all of it without leaving a trace that pointed anywhere except at other people. Someone who was still, right now, unidentified and operational, and watching to see what Dante would do next. He put his hand on the gallery door. He pushed it open, and the first thing he saw, in the low lamplight of the east gallery, was not the 2 men, though they were there, flanking the far window, both armed, both turning toward the sound of the door, but the painting on the wall behind them, the large oil portrait of his father that had hung in this gallery since before Dante was born, and taped to the frame of it, at eye level, a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in a hand he had never seen but recognized immediately from the shape of the letters, from the particular way the pen pressed into the paper, because he had seen documents signed in that hand for 23 years and had trusted every one of them. The hand belonged to his consigliere, the man who had been in Chicago for the last 6 days at a documented conference with 30 witnesses who could place him at every meal and every session. The 4 words on the paper said, This is for Vane. And in that moment, with two armed men in the room and his consigliere's handwriting on the wall and the whole architecture of the last 4 months reassembling itself around a center he hadn't seen, Dante Moretti understood that the man he had trusted most completely, the man who sat at the right hand of every decision he had made for 6 years, had built this, all of it, not for the Kellens, not for money, not for territory, for a debt that wasn't his to collect. And he had done it so cleanly, from such a safe distance, with such perfect deniability, that the only evidence connecting him to any of it was 4 words written on a piece of paper in a room that was about to become very complicated. Dante looked at the 2 men by the window. They were looking at him. Nobody had moved yet, and the stillness in the room had the particular quality of the 3 seconds before something irreversible happens, when every person present understands that whatever comes next cannot be undone, and the only question is who moves first and what they move toward. Dante's hand was still on the doorframe. He looked at the paper on the painting. He looked at the men. He made a decision that was not the decision he would have made 24 hours ago, not the decision the man he had been before this night would have recognized as his own, but the only decision available to a man who has just discovered that the ground he built everything on was never solid to begin with, and the only way forward is through the fire he's standing in. He stepped into the gallery and pulled the door shut behind him. The 2 men by the window moved at the same time. Not toward him. That was the first thing Dante registered, the first piece of information that told him the shape of what he was walking into. They moved apart, separating, one going left toward the fireplace and one going right toward the far bookcase, a practice spread that was designed to split a target's attention and create a crossfire geometry that had no good answer. Trained men. Not the kind of muscle the Kellens used for debt collection, something more deliberate, more expensive. Dante didn't go for cover. Cover was the instinct, and instinct was what they were counting on, because cover in this room meant the heavy oak writing desk to his left, or the settee near the fireplace, and both of those positions were inside the crossfire triangle, and moving to either of them would complete the geometry in their favor. So he stayed at the door. He kept his back to it, and his hands visible, and he looked at the man going left, mid-30s, thick through the shoulders, moving with the economy of someone who had done this before, and he said, clearly and without raising his voice, "I need to talk to whoever sent you." The man going left stopped. The man going right did not stop. He continued to the far bookcase and took a position there, and Dante tracked him with peripheral vision while keeping his primary focus on the one who had hesitated, because the one who had hesitated was the one who had something to calculate, and a man calculating was a man who could be talked to. "Your boss wrote me a note," Dante said. He didn't gesture toward the painting. He didn't need to. The paper was visible to anyone standing in this room, and both men had been in this room for 20 minutes, and they had seen it. Which means he wanted me to know who this is from. Which means this isn't a quiet operation. He kept his voice level, the particular flatness that lived just below command register. "So the question is whether you're here to finish something or deliver something, because those are 2 different jobs and they have 2 different outcomes for everyone in this room." The man by the fireplace, the one who had stopped, looked at the one by the bookcase. A quarter-second exchange. Dante read it. "He's talking. Do we wait?" The one by the bookcase gave the smallest possible nod. So there was a hierarchy. Bookcase was senior. Dante shifted his primary focus accordingly. "You're not here to kill me tonight," Dante said, looking at the one by the bookcase. "If you were, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I'd be on the floor already." He paused. "What does he want?" The man by the bookcase, older than the other one, early 50s, with a stillness that came from somewhere deep and professional, looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket with 2 fingers slowly and produced a phone. He held it out, screen facing Dante, across the 12 feet of gallery floor between them. On the screen was a video call, already connected, already live. And on the other end of it, sitting in a hotel room that had the specific anonymous quality of upscale conference accommodations, beige walls, crown molding, the edge of a window showing a city that was not New York, was a man named Gerald Koss. Gerald Koss, 61, silver-haired, who had sat at Dante's right hand for 6 years and managed the legal architecture of the Moretti organization's surface operations with a precision that had kept 3 federal investigations from ever becoming indictments, and who is currently in Chicago at a documented conference with 30 witnesses who could place him at every session. He was wearing his conference lanyard. Still, it hung around his neck like a prop, which was exactly what it was. "Dante," he said. His voice through the phone was clear, calm. The voice of a man who had prepared for this conversation and was not afraid of it. Dante looked at the phone across 12 feet of gallery floor. He did not move toward it. "Gerald," he said, "I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening." "The paper on the frame," Koss said. "I need you to understand what it means." "It means you built this for Vane's father," Dante said. "The promise my father made. The 40% of Flushing that I buried 18 months ago." He kept his voice flat. "Vane came to you after I turned him away, and you decided that was your vehicle." A small pause on the other end, the pause of a man recalibrating for an interlocutor who arrived further along than expected. "Caruso's father and I were business partners before your father ever met either of us," Koss said. "What your father promised him was legitimate. What you did to that document was theft. The document was disputed. By you. Unilaterally. Without arbitration, without counsel, without telling me, which was a decision you made because you knew I would have told you it was wrong." His voice stayed even throughout, but underneath it something had been running for a long time. Dante could hear it, a current of something cold and accumulated. "I've been with your family for 23 years, Dante. I watched your father build what you inherited, and I watched you maintain it, and I have protected this organization through things that would have destroyed lesser operations, and the first time you did something that I could not protect because it was not defensible, you didn't come to me. You just did it and buried it, and assumed I wouldn't find out. And you decided the appropriate response was to give my financial architecture to the Kellens," Dante said. "I decided the appropriate response was to create enough pressure that you would have to negotiate. With my own network as leverage. With consequences," Koss said. The word was precise, deliberate. "Because you respond to consequences, Dante. You always have. Your father understood that about you, and I understand it. And the only way to get you to the table on something you've decided is finished is to make the cost of it being finished higher than the cost of reopening it." Dante stood at the door of the gallery with 2 armed men in the room and Gerald Koss on a phone screen 12 feet away, and the oil portrait of his father watching from the wall, and he felt the full weight of what the last 4 hours had built toward settle onto him with a clarity that was almost physical. This wasn't a coup. It wasn't a substitution operation. It was a negotiation that had been constructed like a weapon because the man who built it knew that Dante Moretti did not come to tables he wasn't compelled to sit at, which meant the Kellens weren't the point. They were the pressure mechanism. The Brooklyn meeting, the routing maps, the access, all of it was designed to put Dante in a position where the cost of not addressing the Flushing promise was higher than the cost of addressing it. It was, in its architecture, something Dante would have built himself. He almost said so. He didn't. "The woman," Dante said instead. "Elena Voss, Carver putting his hands on her. That was part of your mechanism." The pause that followed was different from the ones before it, shorter and with a different quality. "Carver was operating on Kellen instructions," Koss said. "My arrangement with the Kellens was informational only. What they did with the access was predictable," Dante said. "You gave leverage to people who use leverage violently, and you knew what they were and you did it anyway." His voice had not changed in volume or register, but something in the texture of it had shifted, a tightening that was not quite anger and was considerably more controlled than anger. "She has a 4-hour-old bruise on her face, Gerald, because you needed a mechanism." Silence on the other end. Genuine silence, not calculated. "That wasn't," Koss started. "I know it wasn't the plan," Dante said. "I also know that's not a defense." The man by the bookcase was watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone at a very high-stakes card game who has been told to wait for a signal. The man by the fireplace had not moved since he stopped moving. The room was very still, and through the walls of it the house was coming alive with the sound of the organization waking up, footsteps, distant voices, the sound of the security detail moving to positions. And Dante knew that Nico was in the corridor outside this door right now, 30 seconds from entry, if he gave the word. He had not given the word. "What do you want?" Dante said. "Specifically, tonight. In numbers." Koss took a breath. 40% of Flushing, transferred in trust to Caruso Vane, per the original terms of the agreement, formalized through my office with independent verification. A pause. "And the two men in that room walk out. And the Kellens?" "The Kellens get what they were promised. The routing access is already theirs. I can't undo that. But the substitution plan goes away. They get a territory arrangement in the northern Bronx that I've already negotiated, and they leave your core operation intact." "You negotiated a territory arrangement with the Kellens on my behalf," Dante said, "without my knowledge." "I negotiated a settlement," Koss said, "to a problem you created." "Yes." The tightening in Dante's voice reached its limit and held there, just held, at the edge of something that would have been easy to cross, and that crossing would have felt satisfying for exactly as long as it took the situation to deteriorate beyond recovery. He didn't cross it. "The routing maps they have," Dante said. "How much is already in their system?" "The 3 eastern accounts and the Midtown channels. Nothing west of the park, nothing in Greenpoint." A pause. "I made sure of that." So Koss had limited the exposure while giving the Kellens enough to serve as credible pressure. It was, again, the architecture of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and had been doing it for 23 years, and had not stopped knowing what he was doing even when he turned it against the person he worked for. Dante looked at the portrait of his father. He looked at it for 3 seconds, which was the same amount of time he had allowed himself in the study corridor when the parameters were shifting, and in those 3 seconds, he made a series of calculations that he would never describe to anyone. Calculations about cost and legitimacy and the specific weight of a promise made by a dead man and buried by the living one who inherited it, and about a maid with a bruised face who had been used as a mechanism in a negotiation she had nothing to do with, and about what it meant to maintain something versus what it meant to deserve to. He looked away from the portrait. "Tell your men to sit down," he said. Koss looked at him through the screen. "Dante." "Tell them to sit down, Gerald. I'm not going to do anything dramatic. I'm going to make a phone call, and then we're going to talk about Flushing." He paused. "But I need them sitting down, because I'm about to open that door, and if Nico sees 2 armed men standing and assumes I need help, this conversation ends in a way that is bad for everyone, including you." A beat. Then Koss looked at the man by the bookcase and gave a small nod. Both men sat. The one by the bookcase kept the phone facing Dante. The one by the fireplace put his weapon on the arm of the chair beside him, with the careful deliberateness of a man demonstrating good faith in real time. Dante opened the gallery door. Nico was there. And behind him, Nico's hand on her arm. Not roughly, just the restraint of someone who had found a civilian in a corridor where a civilian shouldn't be, was Elena. She was in her nightgown still, barefoot, the cold pack long gone, and the bruise on her face vivid in the corridor light. And she was looking at Dante with an expression that had moved past fear into something more operational. Alert, watchful, the look of someone who had made a decision to be useful and was waiting to find out if that decision had been the right one. "I heard them go in," she said, 20 minutes ago. "I followed them from the garden entrance." Dante looked at her. He looked at the bruise. He looked at her feet on the cold marble. "How did they get through the garden entrance?" he said. "The gate latch is broken," she said. "The east garden gate. The pin sheared off. I noticed it 2 weeks ago and reported it to Mrs. Albano, and she said she'd have it fixed, and she didn't." A pause. "I should have reported it again." Dante looked at Nico. "Was that in any security log?" Nico pulled out his phone and checked. "Maintenance request, 14 days ago. Not actioned. A broken gate latch. Not a sophisticated breach. Not a compromised system. A maintenance request that fell through the cracks of a house run by humans who forgot things, and 2 men who had done reconnaissance and found it and walked through it in the dark." The most elaborate organizational betrayal he'd encountered in 11 years of running this empire, and the physical entry point was a broken gate pin that cost $40 to fix. He almost laughed. He did not laugh. "Get her a coat," he told Nico, "and get something for her feet." He looked at Elena. "Go back to the kitchen." I mean it this time. She looked at him steadily. Is it over? Not yet. Then I'll go back to the kitchen when it's over, she said. Not with defiance, with the specific, unadorned practicality of someone who has calculated the variables and arrived at a position and is not going to be moved from it by anything short of a direct order she respects. I know this house better than most of the men you have in it. If something goes wrong, you might need that. Dante looked at her for a long moment. The bruise, the bare feet, the steadiness. He turned back to the gallery. Nico, get her something for her feet. He went back inside. What followed in the next 40 minutes was not a negotiation in any conventional sense. It was something closer to an audit, a rigorous, exhausting, occasionally furious accounting of what had been done and what it had cost and what correcting it would require. Koss walked him through the Kellen arrangement in detail, the territorial boundaries, the financial settlement, the specific mechanisms by which the routing exposure could be contained if Dante moved the 3 Eastern accounts tonight. Dante pushed back on the Bronx territory, not because the number was wrong, but because the arrangement had been made without his knowledge, and he needed to be seen to push back, needed the record to show that he had not simply accepted a fait accompli, that there was a version of this settlement that bore his mark as well as Koss's. They fought about the Flushing numbers for 11 minutes. Real fighting, not theatrical, not performative, the grinding specific combat of 2 men who know the same territory from different angles and are not going to yield ground they consider fundamental. Koss held at 40%. Dante pushed to 35. They landed at 37.5 with a 5-year management arrangement that kept operational control within the Moretti structure while the territory revenue transferred to Vane under independent accounting. Dante agreed to it. He agreed to it because it was right, not because Koss had forced him to it, not because the mechanism had worked, but because sitting in the gallery with his father's portrait on the wall and a broken gate in his garden and a woman with a bruised face in his corridor, he had the specific, unwelcome clarity of a man who has been looking at himself accurately for the first time in a while and does not entirely like what he sees. And clarity of that kind, even when it's unwelcome, is the only currency that buys anything real. He agreed to it. The 2 men left through the garden entrance, the same way they'd come in, which struck Dante as a kind of symmetry, and Koss ended the call with a brevity that contained, if not warmth, at least the specific weight of 23 years not being entirely erased by 4 months of warfare. Dante sat in the gallery alone for 4 minutes. Then he stood up and went to find Marco. The restructuring of the 3 Eastern accounts took until 5:40 a.m. Dante and Marco worked in the server room with 2 of the financial staff who had been woken and brought in without being told more than they needed to know, and they moved the accounts through the Greenpoint base using secondary codes that the Kellen routing maps didn't have. And by the time pale light was starting at the east windows, the exposure was contained and the Kellen access was mapped to dead accounts that would show activity for another 72 hours before going dark. They would know eventually. Dante was counting on them knowing eventually, was counting on the moment when they checked the accounts and found the rerouting, because that moment was going to tell him exactly how far their internal analysis had gotten and how long they'd been watching and what they thought they knew. Information, even the information of discovery, was usable if you were watching for it. At 5:55, with the first gray light of a July morning pressing against the east windows, Dante went back to the gallery. He took the paper off the frame of his father's portrait. He held it for a moment. 4 words in Koss's handwriting, "This is for Vane." And then he folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket and looked at the portrait. His father's face looked back at him the way it always had, formal, composed, with the specific impenetrability of oil paint, which showed you exactly what the painter decided you should see and nothing underneath. Dante had spent a significant portion of his adult life trying to read what was underneath and arriving at different answers at different points, and tonight's answer was one he would think about for a long time. He left the gallery. In the North Corridor room, Felix Rourke was asleep in his chair. Genuinely asleep. The boneless, exhausted sleep of a man whose system had crashed after hours of sustained dread. Marco had gotten the account access and the communication records and the phone numbers before he went under, and Rourke's file was now the most documented piece of evidence in Dante's possession. Dante looked at him through the open door for a moment and then closed it quietly. He went to find Caruso Vane. Vane was not in his room. He was in the kitchen, sitting at the island on one of the bar stools, and sitting across the island from him, on the other bar stool, was Elena. They were not talking. They were both holding mugs of something, coffee from the smell of it. And the kitchen had the specific atmosphere of two people who have been through enough in the last several hours that the ordinary social protocols have been stripped away, and what's left is just the fact of two people in a room existing in the same difficult night. Dante stopped in the doorway. Vane looked up. He read Dante's face, whatever was on it, and set his mug down. "Costs," Vane said. "We settled," Dante said. 37.5. 5-year management arrangement, independent accounting. It gets formalized through Coss's office when he's back in New York. Vane was very still. The stillness of a man receiving news that has been the central fact of his life for a significant period of time and is now resolving into something real. His hands were flat on the island's surface. His face did very little, which was his face's habitual mode, but something moved through it that Dante tracked. Not relief exactly, and not triumph. Something quieter and more private than either of those things. "And Koss," Vane said, "his position." "Unchanged," Dante said. "For now." Vane looked at him. "He burned 4 months of your operation." "He also contained the exposure," Dante said. "And he's been protecting this organization for 23 years. That has a weight." He paused. "We'll have a longer conversation about what his position looks like going forward. That conversation isn't tonight." Vane nodded. He picked up his mug. He looked at the surface of the coffee in it, and something in his shoulders dropped. A millimeter, a release of tension that had been structural for a long time. Elena had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who understands that she is adjacent to a world whose full dimensions she doesn't know, and has decided that the intelligent response to that is to listen and observe and wait for the moments when she has something useful to contribute. She looked at Dante now, and the bruise on her face was darker than it had been, but the swelling had gone down slightly with the cold pack and the hours, and her eyes were clear and direct and very tired. "Your father is in New Jersey," Dante said to her. "He's safe. You can call him at 7 when the staff at the facility come on shift." She nodded. "The debt," he said. "The 60,000. It's gone. Whatever your father owes the Kellens, it's gone. I'll have it confirmed in writing through my legal office by end of week." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" "Because the debt was manufactured from money they stole from me," he said. "It was never legitimate. And because—" He stopped. The second reason was not something he had words for yet, or rather it was something he had words for, but none that he was going to say in a kitchen at 6 in the morning with Caruso Vane sitting 12 inches away. "Because it's the right thing," he said. She held his gaze. She didn't say thank you, which he found he was relieved about. Thank you would have made it smaller than it was, would have reduced it to a transaction, and it was not a transaction. It was a correction. She seemed to understand that, or at least to feel the shape of it, because what she did instead was nod once with a deliberateness that gave the nod the weight of something more than acknowledgement. Dante looked at the two of them, Vane with his coffee and his newly resolved history, Elena with her bruise and her bare feet and her coat that Nico had finally found, a large wool thing that swamped her. And he thought about the Brooklyn warehouse, the meeting that Briggs would call, the trap that was still set and waiting and that now needed to be walked into with considerably more preparation than he'd had 12 hours ago. He had the Kellen communication channels from Rourke. He had Vane, who would receive Briggs's contact within 24 hours. He had a contained exposure and a restructured financial network and a consigliere who had shown his hand and been incorporated into the settlement rather than burned out of it. He had pieces. Not enough pieces, not yet, but the shape of what enough would look like was becoming visible. He was about to leave the kitchen, about to start the next phase, the operational planning, the logistics of what Brooklyn was going to require, when Elena said his name. Not Mr. Moretti. His name. The first time she had used it, and she used it the way someone uses a word they've been considering for a while and have decided is the accurate one. "Dante," she said. He turned. "The second man," she said. "The one by the fireplace. He had a radio. Before I followed them in, when they were still in the garden, I heard it. Someone was talking to them on it." She paused. "It wasn't Italian, and it wasn't English." He looked at her. "What language?" "I don't know," she said. But I've been trying to place it for the last 3 hours, and I keep coming back to the same thing. It sounded like—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "There was a man in the building I grew up in. He was from a specific place, and I used to hear him on his phone in the hallway sometimes. The cadence, the specific rhythm of the vowels." Dante waited. "Albanian," she said. It sounded Albanian. The word landed in the kitchen. Dante stood very still. His mind moved fast and without narration, running through what he knew about the Kellen organization's external connections, their import operations, their financial backers, the specific network of relationships that had allowed them to grow in the last 3 years at a speed that the 5 boroughs' established organizations had noted and discussed without quite explaining. The Kellens had Albanian backing, which meant the Kellens were not a local operation with local ambitions. They were a front, or a partner, or a managed asset of something considerably larger and considerably less geographically contained than a New York substitution play, and the routing maps they had taken from Dante's network were not going to be used to step into his shoes. They were going to be used to map the entire northeastern financial architecture and hand it to people who were not from here and did not have here as their limit. Dante's jaw tightened, once, then released. He looked at Elena with the specific attention of a man who has just received the piece of information that changes everything. Not the piece that breaks him, but the piece that finally shows him the correct size of the board he's playing on. The piece that makes everything else make sense. And along with the making sense comes the cold and precise understanding of how much larger and more urgent the Brooklyn meeting now was. How much more was riding on it than territory or organizational pride, or even the 4 months of exposure that Koss had engineered. Because if the Kellens were operating with Albanian backing, the Brooklyn meeting wasn't a trap set by a rival family. It was an audition point for something that reached considerably further than Brooklyn, and the only person who could close it was standing in a kitchen at 6 in the morning with a bruise on her face and cold feet and a wool coat 3 sizes too big, and she had just handed him the key without knowing that's what she'd done. Dante looked at her for a long moment. "How certain are you?" he said. She didn't hesitate. "Certain enough that I'm telling you," she said. "I don't say things I'm not certain enough to say." He believed her. He believed her with the same completeness with which he had believed 4 hours ago that she was telling the truth about Carver, not because he was credulous, but because he had spent his entire life reading people and Elena Voss read, as someone who understood the cost of inaccuracy and priced her words accordingly. "All right," he said. He turned. He took his phone from his pocket. He started to dial. 30 seconds later, when Marco picked up, Dante spoke for 45 seconds without stopping, and Marco was silent throughout. And when Dante finished, there was a pause of 5 seconds, and then Marco said, in the compressed voice, "Albanian." "Yes," Dante said. "Then we can't go into Brooklyn with what we have," Marco said. "No," Dante said. "We need more. We need everything Rourke has on the communication chain, not just the numbers, the metadata. Who called whom first, how many times, the timing patterns." He was moving now, out of the kitchen, into the corridor, heading for the north room and Rourke and the work that was going to consume the next 18 hours. "Wake him up. And Marco." "Yeah." "Get me everything we have on Albanian networks in the Northeast. Everything. I don't care how old it is." He ended the call. He was halfway down the corridor when he heard footsteps behind him, light, quick, bare feet on marble, and he stopped and turned, and Elena was there, the coat open, the mug still in one hand, and she had the look of someone who has made a decision and is 3 seconds past the point where she might have unmade it. "I'm coming," she said. "Elena?" "You need someone who can identify the language in real time," she said. "If there are communications, if there's a recording, you need someone who knows what Albanian sounds like and can tell you what they're saying." A pause. "I grew up in a building where I heard it every day for 6 years. I'm not fluent, but I know enough to tell you if something's wrong." She held his gaze. "That's useful. You know it's useful." He looked at her, the bruise, the bare feet, the coat, the mug. He looked at her for the amount of time it took to run the calculation and arrive at the answer. "Put some shoes on," he said. He turned back toward the north room. Behind him, he heard her footsteps recede toward the kitchen at a pace that was not quite a run. The pace of someone who has been told yes and intends to act on it before yes becomes something else, before the morning fully arrives and the night's permissions expire, moving fast through the house that was filling now with gray light and the sound of men at work, and the specific charged atmosphere of an organization that has survived a night that was designed to end it and is now turning its full and consolidated attention toward what comes next. The Brooklyn warehouse. 18 hours away. And somewhere on the other end of a communication chain that Rourke was about to fully dismantle, a man named Lenny Briggs, who thought the trap he'd set was still intact, who thought the night had gone according to plan, who was going to pick up his phone sometime in the next 12 hours and make a call that he believed would end Dante Moretti's reign in New York. He was going to be wrong, but the cost of making him wrong, the specific exact cost in blood and exposure, and the ruthlessness of what the warehouse required, was something that Dante had not yet calculated, because the Albanian connection had just changed the variables, had just made the stakes exponential, had just turned a local confrontation into a declaration of war against something that did not have borders in the way that New York organizations had borders. And Dante Moretti, walking toward the north room at 6:15 in the morning with the full weight of it on him and 18 hours to prepare, understood with absolute clarity that the man who walked into that warehouse tonight could not be the man who had started this night, could not be the version of himself that had buried a document and turned away a legitimate grievance and assumed that the architecture he'd built was sealed. That man had not been wrong to be feared. But the man walking into Brooklyn would have to be something the Kellens and their Albanian backers had not calculated for, something that the most careful intelligence gathering about Dante Moretti's patterns and responses and decision frameworks had not prepared them to face. He pushed open the door of the north room. Rourke jerked awake in the chair. Dante sat down across from him and put both hands on the table and looked at him with eyes that had not slept and would not sleep and were entirely, completely clear. "Tell me everything," he said, "about who called Briggs first." Rourke talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes. He talked with the specific, exhausted precision of a man who has nothing left to protect and understands that the quality of his information is the only currency he has remaining. And so he spent it carefully, measuring each detail, backtracking when he wasn't certain, correcting himself twice on dates and once on a location name. Dante let him talk without interruption, except when a specific clarification was needed, and Marco sat beside Dante with a tablet and documented everything. The communication chain, the timing, the specific language Briggs had used in 3 of the calls that Rourke had been present for, the meeting protocols the Kellens used for warehouse gatherings of this kind. By 9 in the morning, when pale July sunlight had fully replaced the gray dawn, and the estate had shifted from its overnight emergency posture into something that looked, on the surface, like a normal Tuesday, Dante had enough. Not comfortable enough. Not the kind of enough that felt clean or certain. The kind of enough that meant the operation was possible if everything was executed precisely and nothing failed in the wrong sequence. The kind of enough that professional men in dangerous situations worked with every day because it was the only kind that ever existed. He sent Rourke to a room with a lock on the outside and a bed on the inside and told him to sleep, and Rourke went without argument, which told Dante everything about how thoroughly the man had been emptied out. He found Elena in the small sitting room off the main hall, wearing proper shoes now and the wool coat replaced by a gray cardigan that belonged to someone else, sitting at the writing desk with a notepad in front of her on which she had written, in a tight and careful hand, every Albanian word and phrase she could remember from 6 years of hallway overheard conversations. The list was 2 pages long. Dante looked at the list over her shoulder. He didn't touch it. "How much of this is useful?" She looked at the pages. "Useful for what?" "For understanding context in real time. If there are Albanian speakers at the meeting tonight, not translating, just telling me whether what I'm hearing is an instruction or a question or a threat." She looked at the list for a moment. The tonal differences between a command and a question are detectable even if you don't know the specific words, she said. Yes, I can do that. He straightened. You're not going into the warehouse. She turned to look at him over her shoulder. She didn't argue. She simply held his gaze with the expression she'd been wearing since about 3:30 in the morning, the expression that had replaced the invisible maid's face and that he was still, quietly, adjusting to. The expression of a person who has decided to occupy the full dimensions of who she is and is finished managing herself down to a smaller size. I know, she said, but I can be somewhere close. He looked at her. He thought about the bruise on her face, which had deepened to a color that was almost black at the center, and about Carver who had put it there, and about the specific list of things he intended to ensure happened to Carver before this night was over. We'll discuss it, he said. He knew, from the way she turned back to the notepad, that she had heard yes inside we'll discuss it, and was choosing not to press the point while she had the advantage. He found he didn't mind. The next 9 hours were the kind of work that looked like nothing from the outside. Phone calls made in clipped, careful language, meetings in the server room that lasted 12 minutes and produced decisions that would take days to fully implement. A conversation with Gerald Koss at 2 in the afternoon that was brief and operational and contained none of the weight of the gallery and none of the weight of 23 years, just the technical specifics of the Kellen territorial arrangement and the timeline for the Flushing transfer documentation. Koss was back from Chicago on a 4 o'clock flight. The lanyard, Dante noted from the call, was gone. Caruso Vane spent the morning in the East Wing and reappeared at noon and asked, without preamble, what he could do. Dante put him on the Albanian network research, which Vane accepted without comment, and by 3 in the afternoon, Vane had built a working profile of the specific Albanian criminal network that the Kellens were connected to. An organization out of Shkodër with distribution operations running through northern Italy and into the UK and a fairly recent expansion into North American financial infrastructure, which explained the routing maps with a clarity that made Dante's chest tighten when he read the profile because it meant the substitution plan had never been about New York. It had been about using New York's established network as an entry point into the northeastern financial corridor that connected to Montreal and Toronto and the eastern Canadian ports. And if it had worked, if Dante had been removed and the Kellens had stepped into his operational architecture, the Albanian network would have had access to a financial pipeline that ran from the eastern seaboard to the St. Lawrence and that no federal investigation had ever successfully mapped because it had always looked like ordinary organized crime rather than international infrastructure. He read the profile twice. He gave it back to Vane. Good work, he said. It was not an emotional statement. It was an accurate one. Vane nodded. There was nothing warm in the exchange and nothing hostile. There was the specific quality of two men who have been through something that has reorganized the terms of their relationship and are in the early hours of figuring out what the new terms are, which is a process that takes longer than one morning. At 4:15, Dante called Lenny Briggs. He used Rourke's phone. He used the specific phrasing that Rourke had confirmed Briggs expected, a brevity, a code phrase about a schedule change, the particular verbal signature of a man communicating through an intermediary. Briggs responded in 30 seconds, which told Dante he had been waiting, and confirmed the Brooklyn meeting for 9 p.m. at the warehouse on a waterfront block in Red Hook that smelled, according to Rourke's memory, permanently of diesel and old fish. Briggs sounded calm on the call, satisfied. The sound of a man who believes his mechanism is intact and his evening's work is pre-decided. Dante ended the call and sat for a moment with Rourke's phone in his hand and thought about the difference between confidence and accuracy, which were two things that felt identical from the inside and had completely different outcomes. At 8:45 p.m., they left for Brooklyn. The warehouse district in Red Hook at 9 on a Tuesday night was the specific kind of urban quiet that has nothing peaceful in it. Industrial blocks gone dark, the East River 2 streets over, the smell of salt and metal, the particular silence of a neighborhood that does its loudest work at other hours and is currently holding its breath between them. 3 cars. Dante in the second, Marco driving, Nico in the back. Vane in the first car, which stopped 4 blocks from the warehouse and led him out to approach alone, which was what the Kellens expected, an intermediary coming in ahead of any negotiation. Elena was in the third car, parked 6 blocks back on a cross street with a two-way radio and strict instructions and the two-page notepad in her cardigan pocket. Dante had not told her she couldn't be here. He had told her exactly how far back and exactly what the radio protocol was and exactly under what circumstances she was to drive away without waiting, which were circumstances involving any sound resembling gunfire before the first 15 minutes had elapsed. She had listened to all of it and agreed to all of it, and then said, very quietly, that she hoped none of those circumstances occurred, and he had looked at her in the dim light of the car park behind the estate and said, "So did he." And there had been a moment between those words and the moment they both looked away that had a quality to it that neither of them addressed because there was no time and no language available that was adequate to it. He had looked away first. The warehouse loading bay was lit by 2 industrial floods that turned everything inside yellow-white and left everything outside black. Vane was already inside when Dante walked through the loading bay entrance at 9:03, and Briggs was there. A compact man in his 50s with a face that had the particular topography of someone who has spent decades being useful to dangerous people, features arranged for reliability rather than authority. And beside Briggs were 4 men who were not Kellen organization. The Albanian network's representatives, 2 of them, flanked by what Dante read as personal security rather than operational personnel. Men who were here to observe, not to act, which told him the Albanians were treating this as a verification meeting rather than an execution, which told him the execution was planned for somewhere in the proceedings rather than at the beginning. Briggs looked at Dante walking in and showed nothing on his face, which was the face of a man who had prepared for this specific arrival and was now running through a protocol he'd rehearsed. He extended his hand. Dante shook it. "Mr. Moretti," Briggs said, "I wasn't sure you'd come yourself." "I always handle significant meetings personally," Dante said. "You know that." "I do." Briggs held his gaze 1 beat longer than necessary, and in that beat Dante read the shape of what was supposed to happen. Briggs was not going to trigger anything until the Albanian representatives gave a signal, and the signal was dependent on a confirmation that Dante's security detail outside the warehouse had been accounted for, which meant someone outside was supposed to be handling his security detail right now. And the fact that Dante's security detail was not 3 men he'd brought from the estate, but 12 men positioned in a pattern around the warehouse block that Vane had helped design from the Kellen's own operational protocol, meant that whoever was supposed to be handling them was currently encountering a situation they had not planned for. He waited. He let Briggs run his protocol. He made the conversation about the Bronx territory arrangement, the terms Koss had negotiated, the financial settlement, and he did this with the specific patience of a man who knows the clock is running and trusts the clock. 3 minutes in, one of the Albanian men's phones buzzed. The man looked at the screen. His face changed in a way that was very small and very informative. Dante was watching for it. He saw it. "There's a problem outside," Dante said. Briggs looked at him. "Your perimeter," Dante said. "It's been reversed. The men you positioned to handle my security are currently being handled by mine." He let that settle for precisely 2 seconds. "I want to be very clear that I didn't come here to do anything violent. I came here because this is where the meeting was, and I needed everyone in this room in the same room." He looked at the 2 Albanian men, speaking to them directly now, not to Briggs. "I know who you're connected to. I know what the routing maps were for. And I know that the substitution plan was a pipeline operation, not a territorial one." He paused. "That means we're having the wrong conversation." The taller of the 2 Albanian men, gray at the temples, a suit that cost more than most of the cars outside, the stillness of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered, looked at Dante with an expression of assessment that was almost academic. "You found the network," the man said. His English was precise and barely accented. "I found the shape of it," Dante said, "which is enough to know that what you want from New York is not territory. It's the corridor, Montreal to the coast." The man looked at him for a moment. "And you're offering what?" "A conversation," Dante said. "Not here. Not tonight. With lawyers and accountants and documentation, in a setting that doesn't require anyone to stand in a warehouse in Red Hook pretending this is about debt collection." He held the man's gaze. You went to a great deal of trouble to map my operation, which means you understand how it works, which means you understand that removing me and substituting the Kellens would have given you a corridor that was already degraded, because the Kellens don't have what I've built, they have the map of it, and a map isn't the thing. He paused. I'm the thing. Silence in the warehouse. The floodlights hummed. Briggs had gone very still in the way of a man whose script has reached a page he didn't write. The Albanian man was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his companion. A brief exchange, 3 words, low, in Albanian, and then he looked back at Dante. Through the radio in Dante's jacket pocket, barely audible, he heard Elena's voice say one word. She had heard the Albanian exchange through the open channel. The word she said was legitimate. They were asking each other whether the offer was legitimate. Dante kept his face neutral, but something in him that had been running at maximum tension for the last 18 hours released, very slightly, a single degree. We can have a conversation, the Albanian man said. Briggs looked at Dante with the expression of a man who has just understood that the vehicle he was driving was never going to arrive at the destination he'd been promised, and that the person who promised him the destination had known this for longer than the current meeting had lasted. He looked like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the category for it. Dante looked at him. The debt operations, he said. The enforcement work. The people your organization has been running that against. I want the records, all of them. Names, amounts, interest calculations. And I want Carver. Briggs looked at the floor. Carver specifically, Dante said. Tonight. Briggs nodded. A small, deflated movement. Good, Dante said. Carver was brought to a location in Queens that Dante did not attend personally, because the work done there was handled by men he trusted to do it correctly, and because his presence was not necessary, and his presence at certain things was a line he maintained for his own reasons, which had nothing to do with squeamishness and everything to do with the understanding that a man who is present at everything becomes a particular kind of thing, and he had spent 11 years deciding carefully what kind of thing he was going to be. He did confirm, through Marco, before midnight, that Carver would not be putting his hand on anyone else's face. The warehouse meeting ended at 10:45. The Albanians left first, by arrangement, with the understanding that a formal meeting would be scheduled through legal representatives within 30 days, a timeline that gave Dante time to assess the full scope of the corridor operation and decide what a real partnership looked like versus what a managed separation looked like, which were 2 very different outcomes, and the decision between them would depend on information he didn't yet fully have. He was comfortable with that. 30 days was enough time to know. Briggs left with 2 of Dante's men who had specific questions about the Kellen organization's remaining operations, which Briggs answered with the cooperative thoroughness of a man who has decided that the most important thing now is to not be the last person in the room when the accounting happens. Vane rode back in Dante's car. They didn't talk for the first 15 minutes. The Brooklyn-Queens Expressway at 11 at night was its own particular quiet. Lights on the water, the bridge cables, the specific melancholy of a city that never goes fully dark but gets as close as it ever will in these hours. Marco drove. Nico was in the passenger seat. Dante and Vane sat in the back with 6 inches between them and the weight of the night around them. The warehouse, Vane said finally. You didn't need me there. I needed the protocol design, Dante said, which you built correctly. That took me 4 hours. Yes. Vane looked out the window. The river went past. I spent 4 months building something to force you to a table. You spent 4 hours building a table that absorbed the whole thing. Dante looked at him. Is that a complaint? Vane almost smiled. Not quite. The ghost of one, the shadow a smile would have left. No, he said. It's an observation. They were quiet again. The car moved through the night. The management arrangement on Flushing, Vane said. I want to be involved in the transition directly, not through intermediaries. I know, Dante said. We'll structure it. And costs? Cost stays in his position under modified terms that we'll formalize, Dante said. What he built was wrong. It was also effective, and it surfaced a problem I had created and should have addressed. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the response to them can't only be punitive. He paused. That's not weakness. I know what it is, Vane said. The city passed outside the windows, and the car was quiet the rest of the way. At the estate, just past midnight, the third car was already back. Elena was in the kitchen. She was standing at the stove when Dante came in, and the kitchen smelled of something warm, coffee, and something else, something that required actual cooking. And he stopped in the doorway and looked at the scene with the particular disorientation of a man returning from a night that has required him to be entirely one thing, and encountering, without transition, something entirely different. She turned when she heard him. Her eyes went to his face first, looking for damage, he realized, the same thing he had done when he saw her bruise for the first time. And then to his hands, and then back to his face, and whatever she read there made her shoulders drop a fraction. You're hurt, she said. He looked down. The left side of his jacket was dark at the ribs, a wetness he had been aware of for the last hour and a half, and had been managing with the specific economy of attention of a man who has more urgent priorities. During the perimeter reversal, one of the Kellen men outside the warehouse had gotten a knife into him before Nico had resolved the situation. Not deep. Deep enough. Sit down, she said. Elena, sit down, Dante. He sat down at the island. On a bar stool, which was where she had been sitting 8 hours and a lifetime ago, when he'd handed her a cold pack and she'd told him about Carver. She went to the first aid kit, the serious one, the hard-sided one he'd taken from the cabinet, and she came back and stood beside him and opened his jacket with the efficient, unfrightened hands of someone who had done clinical work before and hadn't forgotten how. She found the cut, which ran along his left lower rib in a 4-inch line that had been bleeding slowly for 90 minutes, and she looked at it with the clinical attention of someone assessing a problem rather than reacting to it. I need better light, she said. Counter, he said. She moved the kit to the counter, and he moved to stand under the overhead light, and she worked with the materials in the kit, saline, gauze, suture strips, the topical antibiotic, and her hands were steady throughout, steadier than the situation warranted, steadier than his own breathing, which had gone ragged in the last few minutes, not from pain, but from the specific exhaustion of a night that had taken everything available and then asked for more. You had nursing training, he said. He'd remembered it from Rourke's file, from the briefing on Elena Voss that he'd reviewed 3 months ago when she was hired and then filed away. 2 years, she said, before my father's situation made it impossible to keep paying for it. She was working on the wound as she spoke, efficient and quiet, and the kitchen was warm and the clock on the wall said 12:17, and outside the rain had come back, very gently, nothing like the violence of the night before, just a soft, consistent presence against the windows. The Albanian, he said, in the warehouse. What did they say to each other? Legitimate, she said, and then one of them said something I couldn't fully parse, something about the original plan being expensive. She pressed a strip of tape along the wound's edge, careful, precise. I think they were relieved. They'd been managing the Kellen operation for 18 months, and I don't think the Kellens were easy to manage. They weren't, Dante said. That's usually the problem with instruments. They don't always go where you point them. She absorbed this without comment, which was one of the things he had noticed about her throughout this night. The specific intelligence of knowing when a thing had been said completely, and adding to it would only dilute it. She finished with the wound, she covered it with gauze, and pressed the edges of the tape down and stepped back and looked at her work the way she'd looked at the notepad, with the quiet assessment of someone whose standard is accuracy rather than approval. That needs to be looked at properly in the next day or two, she said, by someone with actual credentials. I know a doctor, he said. I imagine you know several. He almost smiled. It felt strange on his face, the muscles working in that direction and encountering the resistance of a night that had been made entirely of other kinds of expressions. It made it as far as the corner of his mouth and stayed there. He buttoned his jacket. She closed the first aid kit with the same snap she'd heard 12 hours ago when he'd cracked the cold pack and the kitchen had been a different country with different laws. She went back to the stove. She stirred whatever was in the pot. He stood under the kitchen light and watched her, and the domesticity of the scene had a quality that was almost painful. Not because it was wrong, but because it was the kind of right that he hadn't known how to reach for, and wasn't certain he knew how to hold. Your father, he said. I can have him brought back to the city tomorrow if you want. To a different apartment, somewhere the Kellen network doesn't have on record. We'll handle the relocation. She stirred the pot. He won't understand why. You can tell him whatever you want. I'll tell him the truth, she said. He's old enough to hear it. She paused. He's been afraid of those people for 8 months. I think knowing it's over will matter more to him than the disruption. It's over, Dante said. The debt is gone. The Kellen enforcement operation is finished. Briggs gave us the records tonight. A pause. All of it. Every name on their debt list. Every enforcement action. I'll have my legal office process the formal releases this week. She stopped stirring. She stood at the stove with her back to him and her shoulders very still, and he understood that she was absorbing the full scale of what that meant. Not just her father, but every person on that list, every person who had been carrying a Kellen debt through fear for months or years, people she didn't know and would never meet, and whose relief was real and was going to happen because a maid had come downstairs at 3 a.m. for ice. She turned around. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible in the specific quality of her stillness. Okay, she said. One word. Compressed and complete. He nodded. She plated 2 bowls of whatever was in the pot. Something simple, something with broth. And she set one on the island in front of a bar stool, and she sat down on the other one, and she picked up a spoon, and she ate. And after a moment, Dante sat down on the bar stool where she had sat 8 hours ago with a cold pack in her hands, and he picked up the other spoon, and they ate in a silence that was not empty. Outside the kitchen window, Long Island Sound was somewhere in the dark, and the rain was still going, and the night was maybe an hour from the first suggestion of morning, and inside the kitchen was warm and quiet, and the copper pots overhead were still, and the crack in the tile near the base of the island was still there. The small flaw in the otherwise perfect surface that Elena had noticed every morning when she mopped, the thing that was always there and never got fixed, the kind of imperfection that a house accumulates over decades and learns to incorporate without anyone deciding to. Dante ate the soup, which was good, simple and warm, and exactly what the body needed at 12:30 in the morning after a night like this one. And he thought about the things that remained. The Albanian negotiation, which was 30 days away, and would require the kind of preparation that filled months. The Flushing transfer, which Cost would manage, and which would take the rest of the year to fully implement. Rourke, whose situation he would deal with tomorrow in a conversation that would be brief and final. Vane, who would need a new kind of relationship that neither of them had the language for yet, but would develop, as things do, through the pressure of shared work. And the woman across the island, who had been hired 7 months ago as a live-in maid, and who had come downstairs for ice, and instead found a traitor and an Albanian network, and the center of something she had no reason to be at the center of, and who had been at the center of it steadily, without drama, with the steady, practical intelligence of someone who had been underestimated for a long time, and had developed, through that underestimation, a very clear sense of exactly what she was. He looked at her. She was looking at the soup. "You're not going back to the staff quarters," he said. She looked up. "I'm not offering you something in exchange for tonight," he said. "That's not what this is. I'm telling you that the arrangement you were hired under is over, and there's a different one available if you want it." He held her gaze. "This house needs someone who understands how it actually runs, not the visible surface of it, the real architecture, how information moves, where the pressure points are, what the weaknesses look like from inside." A pause. "You identified more of that in one night than people who have worked here for years." She looked at him steadily. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a position that doesn't have a good title yet," he said. "The shape of it is something we'd have to figure out. As part of the organization." He was quiet for a moment. "Adjacent to it," he said, "in the way that any person who knows this much about this operation is adjacent to it, regardless of what their job title is." She looked at the soup. She looked at the window. She looked at the copper pots above the island, still and familiar, the same pots she had cleaned twice a week for 7 months. "I want my father settled first," she said. "Of course." "And I want the nursing program," she said. "The tuition. Not as a gift, as a term of the position. If I'm going to be useful to you the way I was tonight, I should finish the credential." He looked at her, the directness of it, Not gratitude, not submission, but the clean exchange of a person who knows her value and states it plainly without apology. Agreed, he said. She nodded. She picked up her spoon. She ate another spoonful of soup with the composed, practical air of someone who has concluded a negotiation and is done with it. They finished eating. She took the bowls to the sink and rinsed them without being asked, the habit of 7 months still running in the same channels as everything that had changed around it. And he watched her and thought about the nature of habits, how they outlasted the conditions that built them, how they carried forward into new country and kept working, kept being useful, even when nothing around them resembled what they were built for. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She hung it back on the oven rail. She turned around. "The kitchen where I cried," she said. She said it simply, the way someone states a coordinate, not with emotion, not making it significant beyond what it was. That was 4 hours ago, and it feels like a year. It was more than 4 hours, he said. It feels longer than whatever it was. He nodded. He looked at the kitchen, the island, the copper pots, the overhead lights, the crack in the tile, the window with the rain going quiet beyond it, the door that he had locked from the inside when he found her, and that had never, in all the hours since, been locked against her. "Go get some sleep," he said. She picked up the wool coat from the back of the bar stool. She didn't put it on, just held it over her arm, the way you carry something you've been given that you've decided to keep. She looked at him once more, a direct look with the bruise still vivid on her face and her eyes clear and dry and steady. The look of a person who has come through something and arrived somewhere and is still, very precisely, themselves. Then she went out of the kitchen door, and he heard her footsteps in the corridor, not fading toward the basement stairwell and the staff quarters, but going the other direction toward the main stairs, toward the guest rooms on the second floor, because she was not going back to the room she'd started this night in, and she knew it, and so did he. He stood in the kitchen alone. The rain had stopped entirely. The clock on the wall said 12:51. In a few hours, the first of the morning staff would begin arriving, and the house would resume its visible surface operations. And to every external observer, it would be a Tuesday morning at the Moretti estate, ordinary and contained, and nothing in the surface would show the night that had happened inside it. The routing maps would be dead accounts by morning. The Flushing documentation would be drafted by the end of the week. The Albanian negotiation was 30 days away, and he had 30 days to understand exactly what he was negotiating and what he was not. Felix Rourke would be dealt with tomorrow, and Gerald Koss would land at JFK at 6:15, and Caruso Vane would sleep for the first time in 8 months without the specific weight of an unresolved debt pressing down on him. And somewhere in New Jersey, in a secure facility that smelled of antiseptic and was staffed by people who didn't ask questions, an old man named Voss was sleeping without knowing that the thing that had been following him for 8 months was gone, and would learn in the morning from his daughter's voice on the phone that he was safe, that the number they'd been calling with threats was no longer connected to anything that could reach him, that the debt was erased and the fear was over, and none of it, not a single dollar, not a single month of interest, had ever been legitimately owed. Dante turned off the kitchen light. He stood in the dark for a moment, which was the same dark the kitchen had been when he first stepped out of the shadows and saw her, and it had the same rain-soaked quiet and the same copper pots overhead and the same crack in the tile. But everything else had been reorganized around those constants into something that would take time to fully map and that he was not going to rush. He was a man who had built an empire by understanding which things were worth protecting and which things were not, and by being honest with himself about the difference, even when the honesty was costly. The night had been costly. He walked out of the kitchen and through the dark main hall and up the stairs, and the house held itself around him the way a house does when it has survived something. Not triumphant, not scarred, just present, just continuing. The way things that are built to last continue past the moments that test them and keep standing in the morning. Outside, the last of the clouds were moving off the sound. Somewhere to the east, the first gray suggestion of a Thursday morning was deciding whether to begin. It began.